So excited to be here talking to Diego, also better known as Young Pueblo. And we're going to talk about love and self-love and what love means. And I know, how many people know of Diego or Young Pueblo through Instagram? Yes. I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with social media. I'm like, is it really good? I want to stay away from it, and then I'll go back on, and then maybe you have that. And when I saw how Young Pueblo was using Instagram, I had a whole new appreciation for it. So thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us. And I would love to talk about self-love and your thoughts on that, and your writing on that, and why that matters. And kind of why that became something that really mattered to you and how it resonates with people. So.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for having me again. Yeah. It's always this is one of the highlights of my year. So thank you so much for making this happen and for gathering all these amazing people. I think initially for self-love, I started writing pretty seriously back in 2015. And around that time, self-love was a big topic that a lot of people on the internet were thinking about, trying to figure out, what does self-love really mean? Is this something that I can actually activate in my life? Is this something that I can really gain from? And it's really funny because over the years of hanging out on the internet, you start noticing that humanity is really having a conversation with itself. And I think one of the things that really shined on me during that time is that self-love is real, and the way that I personally define it is doing what you need to do to be free, and doing what you need to do to heal yourself. And to me, freedom is essentially literally decreasing the mental tension that you experience in your mind. Oftentimes we live life and there's so much stress, so much anxiety that we sort of walk on top of these very dense concrete layers of conditioning without ever realizing that we could actually feel better. There's a lot of talk about trauma, and of course people have gone through very intense things, but there isn't as much talk about general conditioning that's sort of driven by craving and aversion, the type of conditioning that stops you from being in the present moment, the type of things that really sort of slow you down from being able to profoundly appreciate that you are who you are, that things are ultimately okay, and that a lot of times the difficulties that we experience are really made up stories that we're creating in our minds.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about how you became aware of those stories and how you work with some of those stories? Because often people, particularly engaging online, you see this one picture of these people in Hawaii having this great vacation, and you have this other picture of these people who is smiling, and so there's a way in which our comparison mind gets really activated, and all of a sudden we feel less about ourselves because the data appears that everybody else is living this other great life. So can you talk a little bit about how you help to notice that and kind of reframe that, or reframe your experience in those moments?
Yeah, I think it really, connecting even back to the topic of this conversation about the spiritual journey, when I was going through my own dark night, just going through the difficulties of not knowing myself, living life through this very intense sort of mental struggle and not even really being aware that it was happening. But it took, and this is for me personally, I don't necessarily believe that everybody has to go through hitting rock bottom to become wiser and freer. But for me personally, it was through hitting rock bottom, realizing that a lot of my actions were driven by this massive pursuit for pleasure. I didn't realize how pleasure had just sort of hijacked my mind and driven me to just making all these really bad decisions, from partying all the time, really taking drugs, abusing alcohol, just doing way too much to get these short-term bursts of gratification that never really amounted to anything after that. I really still, the next morning I'd wake up and I'd feel terrible, but I think the journey of really becoming honest with myself and starting to notice those patterns that were, totally moving me away from having real self-love, from away from actually knowing who I was as an individual, it took me hitting a bit of a wall to see that, okay, now I need to practice radical honesty. So even before I started meditating, it was the act of radical honesty, turning that lens inward and just seeing, what's happening with me. Mm-hmm. At the moment when I feel some sort of anxiety or some sort of, wanting to get away from myself through either smoking more weed or hanging out with friends and not really, doing something to just get away from myself. And I say getting away from, hanging out with friends, obviously it's fantastic to have friends, but I recognize that the way I would use my friends was as an escape from myself. And I wasn't actually having deep connection with them. I was literally just like, how can you make me laugh so that I don't feel terrible anymore?
Right.
That radical honesty was what started everything, and I think really started that walk into self-love becoming real and breaking down all those old stories.
And how did you work internally with your meditation practice around it intentionally? Like, I know there's like loving kindness meditations, or there's like active, like I'm actively going to cultivate love in this moment, or was it just kind of seen through all the conditioning and then love just shows up more once you see through the conditioning?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, so for the first year, I think I worked really directly with myself, and that was before I started meditating. But once I picked up a technique and I found something that really was meeting me where I was at, I practiced Vipassana as taught by S.N. Goenka. And this is, a really old technique, something that's been around for like 2,600 years. And I wasn't directly working with the actual, like this is my trauma, these are my miseries. It was more so, as opposed to being caught in the delusion and the storm of these stories, instead I was focusing on what is real, what is reality. And I was learning about impermanence, learning about how everything arises and passes away. Not just your thoughts and your emotions, but literally on the physical, sensational level, like feeling it in your sensations of the body, that everything is arising and passing. And there's a big power in truly observing what's real. There's a moment where you're no longer just swimming in your personal conditioning anymore, but you're in contact with what is actually real about the universe. And when you're there, feeling the actual impermanence that's just sort of the undercurrent of everything that exists, there is this immediate cleansing that happens. And so many of these old patterns start burning away. So what I like to tell people is when they're starting off on their journey and they're looking for a technique, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You don't have to a lot of people, they start meditating, but they don't necessarily know what they're doing. So go find someone who does know what they're doing. Find a good teacher or a guide, someone that can give you a good technique. You don't necessarily have to create something out of nothing, because honestly, there are so many fantastic techniques out there, and we really do live in a special time in human history where so many things are available for us to really undo these patterns and feel much better and make way better decisions.
And then you also talk about the self-love and then more of the expansive love. And I know you also talk a lot about relationships and the role of love and working on yourself in the relationships. And you always emphasize, and I try to remind myself of this too, the goal isn't to change your partner, the goal is to grow yourself.
Definitely.
Right? And the more that we love ourselves, the more that we can love somebody else. Can you talk a little bit about your learning in that relational dimension around what love is and maybe what it isn't?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm just going to be really candid and relay what Soren and I were talking about backstage. So one thing that we have both been noticing in our separate relationships with our partners is that, we're, right, I'm with my wife and we're a couple together, but as individuals, we're doing a lot of individual personal growth. And sometimes that creates a little bit of friction in our relationship, because one person or both at the same time will be actually going through taking these big leaps forward in their growth, where they're undoing so much conditioning that old things will be coming up, and you'll feel the intensity of the past in a really raw way. And then you might be quite short-tempered, you might not feel well, you'll be feeling these old emotions, and that'll cause some sort of scuffle in your relationship. And honoring the reality that if you're in a couple that is built and based on growth, there are going to be these moments where there are these, little bits of storms that you have to go through together, and just realizing that ultimately it's for the best in the long run, because then you're going to have deeper connection, more real love, right? Not like attached love, but like real love where you're connecting on a profound level where, as you were saying, I'm not trying to change you, but I'm trying to be with you. We're going to try to be together.
Yeah. And it feels like that's the one of the kind of the hardest and yet kind of most important shifts, which is just like, I have to look at myself, because it's so easy to look at somebody else and be like, if only you did this, but you have to look at yourself. And I think that process of loving oneself can feel like selfish or arrogant. And I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about like, what is it, like the Surgeon General spoke about, like this quality of like, are we here bringing forth love, or are we here bringing forth fear?
Yeah.
And how will you navigate with those qualities?
One thing that I've seen kind of surfing through the internet is people saying that, it's okay to be selfish, to like sort of combining the idea of self-love with it's okay to be selfish. But honestly, it's not selfish at all, right? For you to develop your personal freedom, for you to actually heal yourself and spend this time, right? And not necessarily in solitude, but just taking these moments to cultivate your mind, that's going to benefit every single person around you, because you're going to be much more energetic, much more creative, much more loving, and a lot just not driven by your ego, because the ego is there for defense. And if we're dealing with people in this like mode of defense, then you're not going to be able to thrive together in a real way. But it's just,
And do you still spend 2 hours a day in your meditation practice?
Yeah. It's been about 5 years now. Meditating 2 hours a day. I do 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening. And honestly, taking that time to myself to be able to really connect with what's real has helped me just be less of a jerk. Yeah.
Well, we just have a few more minutes, but can you say, because I feel like a lot of people resonate, like I sometimes will feel like, wow, I'm really mature, I'm really growing, and then I just am a total jerk. I'm a total asshole.
Yeah.
I'm like, really, I said that? And it's hard in those moments because I feel like I'm making progress.
Yeah.
And how can you help me? Like, I don't know.
That's interesting, because I have the opposite pattern where it's like, I'm not growing at all, I'm doing so bad. And I'll turn to my wife and I'm like, why am I such a terrible person? And my wife is like, you're being ridiculous. Like she'll just tell me like, no, you're fine. Because it's funny, we don't realize that when we're doing a lot of this very intentional personal growth, the mind becomes like a microscope. Right? You're taking time to notice the shifts in these patterns that are happening inside you. Whether you're working with your sensations or your thoughts, your mind is just getting closer and closer and closer, because you're trying to pierce into like, what is the human condition? What's actually happening right now? But when your mind becomes like a sharpened microscope, these things that, when you're noticing, oh, there's my anger, there's this aversion, there's this sort of intensity, and you notice the tiny moments where you might lash out, or you might say something with sort of a dense energy, you'll see it so clearly and you're like, oh, dang, like I'm not that good of a person. But in reality, it's one of the worst ways to measure yourself, right? You don't want to measure yourself with a microscope. You actually want to take a giant mental step back and look at yourself from where you began to where you are now. Because in that moment, right, it's not going to be linear, like A to Z, and you move straight up. No, it's going to be this like fluctuation that's constantly happening, and it will have an upward trajectory, but to notice it and see it by taking a big mental step back really matters. And oftentimes I like fall prey to that over and over, and I'm like looking at myself so closely, and then I'm like, oh, you haven't made any progress at all. But then my wife reminds me, take a step back and then examine.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do feel that's a process. Somebody said, actually Andrea Levine and her husband Stephen used to say, we learn to be loving by watching how unloving we are at times. Like we have to be able to see how unloving we are at times, but we have to be able to see that with love.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just constantly coming at ourselves. And I feel like that's such an important process, right? Because as you're becoming more loving, the process of becoming more loving inevitably means seeing things that maybe we don't want to see.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that process, whether it's really just taking that global, larger framework of it. And you also called your book Inward, which I think is it's available in the bookstore. Please check it out if you haven't checked it out. And my guess is you called it Inward because you feel like that's the core of your teaching or a core of what you want to get across. Is it's an inner journey? Or can you say more about what do you feel like is kind of the core of what all your writings have in common?
I think there's this big sort of, right, like I really think of Young Pueblo as a project, right? My name's Diego Perez. My name's not Young Pueblo. Young Pueblo it's a piece of social commentary. It's essentially me trying to, like, once I started meditating, I started noticing that humanity as a whole, we're very young. We treat each other very roughly. We treat ourselves very roughly, and there's so much growth that we can do. The common example that I give to people is that when you go to kindergarten, like, what are the basic things that your teachers are trying to teach you, right? To clean up after yourself, to tell the truth, to not hit each other, and to generally be kind to one another. Can we do these things as a whole of humanity? Not at all. So there's a big room for growth, and I think that's sort of the like nexus of this work that I'm trying to do. Is when I started noticing how important it was for individuals that they can actually heal themselves, like right with good techniques, with good effort, we can actually take our evolution into our hands and start growing in very profound ways. And if more and more people start doing that, that will make a massive shift in our global situation, especially during this century where not only do we have so many tools, but we have these tremendous challenges in front of us. And I think that's what really binds everything together. So I focus on the individual in the hopes that, this is like my tiny part, because there's so many people trying to do something to make the world better.
Beautiful. And your contribution is amazing too. So thank you. Whenever people ask me of an example of using Instagram and social media for better world activities, I was like, you got to check out Young Pueblo. So thank you for joining us. You're also going to be doing, I know, some other things, a breakout here and other conversations.
Yeah,
so check your schedule out. Diego's around most of the time too. So real deep appreciation and thank you for everything.
Thank you all so much.